The firebase sat on a hill that had no name, only a grid coordinate that would later be classified. Dust hung in the air like a funeral shroud, and the radio chatter had gone quiet in that particular way that makes veterans check their weapons. Captain Michael Torrens stood in the operations center with his hand pressed against the plywood wall, feeling the distant thump of mortars through the wood grain like a pulse. 3 platoons were pinned in the valley below, and the QRF had taken an IED 2 clicks out. He'd called for air support 17 minutes ago. The sky remained empty. "Sir, we've got movement on the ridgeline," his XO reported, voice tight. "They're maneuvering for envelopment." Torrens didn't respond immediately. He was doing the mathematics of disaster in his head, angles of fire, time to collapse, casualties per minute. The numbers weren't good. They were never good in places like this, in countries that appeared on maps but felt like they existed outside geography, outside time. His men were dying in a valley that would be forgotten by next week's news cycle, and the A-10s from Bagram were still 12 minutes out. 12 minutes might as well be 12 hours. "Get me whoever's available," he said quietly. "I don't care if they're flying a fucking Cessna." The radio operator's hands moved across the panel with practiced efficiency. Static crackled through the speakers. Then a voice emerged, calm, almost bored, with a slight rasp that suggested too many missions and not enough sleep. "Anvil 7-2 checking in. Single ship, Winchester on Mavericks but holding gun. What have you got for me?" The voice was female. Torrens felt something shift in his chest, not disappointment exactly, but a recalibration of expectations. In 12 years of calling for close air support, he'd worked with exactly 3 female pilots. All of them had been competent. None of them had been flying alone into a shitstorm like this. "Anvil 7-2, Wildfire Actual. I've got 3 platoons in a kill box, approximately 80 enemy combatants with machine gun nests and probable mortars. Danger close situation developing. How soon can you be on station?" There was a pause, brief but weighted with calculation. "I'm looking at you now, Wildfire, 2 minutes." Torrens moved to the window. The sky remained empty, pale blue fading toward dusk. He couldn't hear engines, couldn't see contrails. For a moment he wondered if the voice on the radio was real or just something his exhausted mind had conjured from desperation and dust. Then he saw it, a dark cross against the sun, low and getting lower, moving with the kind of aggressive geometry that separated the experienced from the reckless. The A-10 Thunderbolt came in at 400 feet, and even from 2 clicks away, Torrens could see something was wrong. The left wing was shredded. Metal strips peeled back from the leading edge like skin from a wound, and part of the aileron was simply gone, trailing smoke that wrote brief hieroglyphics against the sky before dissolving. The aircraft yawed slightly in flight, overcorrected, then settled into an approach that defied everything Torrens knew about aerodynamics. It should not have been flying. It definitely should not have been diving toward a hot LZ with the kind of controlled fury that suggested its pilot had personal business with gravity. "Wildfire Anvil 7-2. I need your best estimate on friendly positions. I'm making one pass and it needs to count." The voice was still calm, but Torrens heard something underneath, now not fear, but a kind of focused intensity that he recognized from men who'd stopped counting missions and started counting heartbeats. "Stand by for coordinates," he said, and began reading numbers that would decide who lived and who became a name on a wall in Washington. The A-10 banked hard, revealing the underside of its fuselage. Even through binoculars, Torrens could see the carbon scoring, the missing panels, the hydraulic fluid streaming from a severed line. The aircraft was dying in real time, staying aloft through nothing but momentum and willpower, though whether that willpower belonged to the pilot or the machine itself was becoming unclear. "Anvil 7-2, be advised you are trailing significant fluids. Recommend you abort an RTB for assessment." "Negative, Wildfire. I've got good gun and your people don't have 2 minutes. cleared hot. Torrens looked at the valley where his men were dying. He looked at the crippled aircraft making its final turn. He thought about the voice on the radio, calm as Sunday morning, flying a machine that should have already been a crater. "Cleared hot," he said. "God be with you." "He usually is," the voice replied, and the A-10 began its run. The sound reached the firebase 3 seconds before the visual that distinctive, apocalyptic roar of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a weapon so violent that the aircraft was essentially built around it rather than the other way around. 70 rounds per second, each one the size of a milk bottle, churning the earth into chaos at 4,000 feet per second. The noise was physical, pressing against eardrums and chest cavities like a shockwave made of pure aggression. Through the binoculars, Torrens watched the ridgeline erupt. Dust, rock, and other things rose into the air in a curtain that obscured everything. They pulled up hard, trailing more smoke now, pieces of something faring maybe, or cowling separating from the fuselage and tumbling away like autumn leaves. "Good effects on target," Torrens reported, voice professionally neutral despite the fact that his hands were shaking. "Enemy positions neutralized. Anvil 7-2, that's excellent work. RTB immediately for Wildfire, I've still got gun, and I've got secondary positions lighting up on your 6 o'clock. Request clearance for second pass." "Negative," Torrens' voice cracked with uncharacteristic urgency. "Anvil, you are critically damaged. I cannot in good conscience." Good conscience noted and appreciated Wildfire. "But unless I'm missing something, you've still got people in that valley, and I've still got bullets. Math's pretty simple from where I'm sitting." The A-10 was already banking, that impossible turn with the damaged wing dipping toward Earth at an angle that made Torrens' stomach drop. He could see into the cockpit now, just barely a helmet, a gloved hand on the stick, shoulders set with the kind of determination that belonged in a different era, when pilots flew canvas biplanes and relied on pocket watches and prayer. "Anvil 7-2, I need you to identify yourself. What's your name?" Static crackled for a moment, and Torrens thought maybe the radio had finally given out, that he was watching a ghost make one last run before disappearing into whatever sky dead pilots flew to. Then the voice came back, and it wasn't calm anymore. It was something harder, something forged in fires he couldn't imagine. "Kestrel," she said. "Call signs Kestrel, and I don't leave people behind." The second gun run was even lower than the first. Torrens watched the A-10 drop to what couldn't have been more than 200 feet, skimming the valley floor with its landing gear almost brushing the scrub brush. The GAU-8 opened up again, and the enemy positions that had been maneuvering for a flanking attack simply ceased to exist. Tracer fire reached up toward the aircraft like desperate fingers, and at least 3 rounds punched through the already damaged wing, but Kestrel held the run for a full 4 seconds, an eternity at that altitude in that much fire, before pulling up. The A-10 climbed with all the grace of a wounded bird, shedding parts with each degree of elevation. The left engine was coughing now, producing thick black smoke that trailed behind like a banner. Hydraulic fluid created rainbow patterns in the exhaust stream. Something important-looking fell away from the tail section and tumbled into the valley below. "Anvil 7-2, Wildfire, you need to get that bird on the ground. Where's your nearest divert field?" "Honestly, Wildfire, I'm not sure I've got enough control left to make a field. Thinking I might just point her toward empty desert and take the silk elevator." Torrens gripped the radio so hard his knuckles went white. "Negative, Kestrel. Bagram has equipment standing by. You can make it." "Bagram's 40 minutes northeast, and I've got maybe 10 minutes of flying time left before this bird decides it's done pretending to be an aircraft." "Then you glide, you crash land in a field. You do whatever you have to do, but you do not punch out over hostile territory. Do you understand me?" There was a long pause. The A-10 was visible now to everyone at the firebase, a dark silhouette against the darkening sky, struggling for altitude like a fighter who won't stay down. Men had emerged from bunkers and fighting positions to watch, their faces turned upward in silent witness. "Roger that, Wildfire, I'll do my best, tell your people." The voice paused, and for the first time Torrens heard something that might have been pain. "Tell them they fought well. It was an honor to cover them." "The honor was ours, Kestrel. Now get yourself home." The A-10 turned northeast, trailing smoke and debris, and the quiet respect of everyone who'd watched it fight. The firebase fell silent after the A-10 disappeared over the ridgeline. Not the silence of peace, but the hollow quiet that follows impossible things. Torrens stood in the operations center watching the radar track fade, listening to Kestrel's labored breathing over the radio as she coaxed her dying aircraft toward salvation or disaster. At this point, it was hard to say which. "Wildfire, Anvil 7-2. I've lost hydraulics in the primary system. Secondaries at maybe 30%. Sticks getting mushy." "Copy, Kestrel. Bagram's been notified. They're rolling equipment now. Tell them not to bother with the gentle approach. This bird's coming in hot or not at all." Torrens closed his eyes briefly. In the valley below, medevac birds were landing, extracting wounded who would live because a woman he'd never met had flown a dead aircraft into hell and bought them time measured in seconds and paid for in pieces of fuselage scattered across hostile territory. "Kestrel, how'd you get that call sign?" He didn't know why he asked. Maybe because if this went wrong, he wanted to know something real about the voice on the radio. Something beyond grid coordinates and kill confirmations. Static crackled for a moment. When she spoke again, there was something almost like amusement in her voice, though it was hard to tell through the strain. "Kestrels are these small falcons, not impressive like eagles or hawks. People underestimate them, but they've got this thing they hover in place, perfectly still, watching. Then when the moment's right, they dive, fast and precise and absolutely committed. My instructor called me that after I landed a sim with both engines out and the tail section on fire. Said I had that same kind of patience followed by controlled violence. Name stuck." Sounds like he knew what he was talking about. "She, Major Patricia Cowery, retired now. Best pilot I ever flew with. She taught me that fancy hardware doesn't mean shit if you haven't got the judgment to use it right. Said the aircraft doesn't make the pilot makes the aircraft what it needs to be." The A-10 was 15 minutes from Bagram now, losing altitude in a controlled descent that was becoming less controlled by the minute. Fire trucks and ambulances were staging on the taxiway. Medical teams were standing by. Everyone was doing everything they could except the one thing that mattered, which was keeping that aircraft in the air for another 14 minutes. "She'd be proud of you today," Torrens said quietly. "Maybe, or maybe she'd chew my ass for taking unnecessary risks with government property." There was a pause then. "Wildfire, I need to focus on flying now. If I don't make it, tell." "You're going to make it, Kestrel." "Right, of course. See you on the ground." The radio went quiet. Torrens stood watching the radar screen like it was a prayer. At Bagram, Staff Sergeant Luis Mendoza watched the sky with the kind of attention usually reserved for incoming mortars. He'd been working the flight line for 6 years, and he'd seen damaged aircraft before birds with bullet holes, cracked canopies, engines running rough after taking shrapnel. But he'd never seen an A-10 come limping home looking like it had been through a metal shredder and somehow remembered how to fly. "Jesus Christ," his crew chief muttered, binoculars pressed to his face. "Half that left wing is gone. How is she even maintaining attitude?" "She's not," Mendoza said flatly. "She's falling in a controlled manner and calling it flying." The A-10 appeared over the perimeter fence at 300 feet, lower than regulation, trailing smoke from the left engine, and what looked like fuel or hydraulic fluid from a dozen different punctures. The landing gear deployed with visible reluctance. The left main tire was shredded, and the nose gear was canted at an angle that suggested structural damage to the strut itself. "Tower, Anvil 7-2 on final. I've got minimal control authority and no intention of going around. This is a one-shot deal." The tower controller's voice was professionally calm, but Mendoza could hear the tension underneath. "Roger, Anvil 7-2. Runway's yours. Emergency crews standing by." The approach was wrong from the start. Too steep, too fast, the damaged wing dropping every few seconds before the pilot muscled it back level. At 200 feet, the left engine quit entirely, the sudden loss of thrust yawing the aircraft sideways. At 100 feet, the nose pitched up sharply over correction or loss of hydraulics, impossible to tell from the ground. At 50 feet, Kestrel dropped the nose and committed to the landing with a kind of aggressive certainty that separated survivors from statistics. The A-10 hit the runway hard, right main first, then nose, then left main, collapsing immediately as the shredded tire disintegrated on impact. The aircraft slewed left, throwing sparks from the exposed metal grinding against concrete. The left wing tip caught and crumpled, spinning the A-10 in a slow rotation that seemed to last forever and probably took 3 seconds. Foam and water from the emergency trucks created a white curtain as Kestrel fought to keep the aircraft from flipping, from cartwheeling, from turning into a fireball at the end of a debris field. The A-10 slid 200 yards before stopping, resting at an angle with the canopy facing away from the emergency crews. Smoke poured from both engines. Small fires flickered along the damaged wing, and for a moment that stretched into infinity, nothing moved. Then the canopy cracked open. A gloved hand appeared first, then a helmet, then a flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid and streaked with carbon. Captain Elena Vasquez, 32 years old, from a neighborhood in Albuquerque that most people avoided, and nobody wrote songs about, climbed out of the cockpit with the careful movements of someone checking to make sure all their parts still worked. She made it 3 steps before her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the wing of the aircraft that had saved her life, and the lives of 37 soldiers she'd never met. The medics reached her first, but the ground crew wasn't far behind. Mendoza watched as they helped her down from the wreckage, saw the way she turned back to look at the A-10 with something in her expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. "Ma'am," he said when she was on solid ground, "that was the finest piece of flying I've ever seen." She looked at him with eyes that had seen things ground crews didn't have to imagine, and she smiled, tired and pained, and absolutely genuine. "Wasn't me," she said. "That bird did all the work. I was just along for the ride." They took her to medical, ran tests, checked for injuries that somehow didn't exist beyond bruises and a wrenched shoulder. While doctors prodded and questioned, the story spread through Bagram like gospel. The A-10 that wouldn't quit, the pilot who'd made 2 gun runs with a dying aircraft, the landing that defied physics and common sense in equal measure. By the time Elena was released from medical 6 hours later, she'd become something more than a pilot. She'd become a story that people would tell, a name that would be invoked in ready rooms when the mission looked impossible and the odds looked worse. Word reached the firebase by midnight. Torrens took the call in the operations center, alone except for the night watch officer who pretended not to listen while listening to everything. "Wildfire actual, Bagram TOC. Anvil 7-2 is on the ground safe. Pilot's banged up but walking. Thought you'd want to know." Torrens felt something unknot in his chest that he hadn't realized was there. "Roger that, Bagram. Please pass along our thanks. That pilot saved a lot of lives today." "Will do, Wildfire." Bagram out. He hung up the handset and stood in the quiet operations center, thinking about a voice on the radio and an aircraft that had stayed in the sky through pure defiance. Outside, the valley where 37 soldiers had nearly died was dark and peaceful, and the stars were coming out like witnesses to something that would be remembered long after the firebase itself was forgotten. In her quarters at Bagram, Elena lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Her shoulder ached. Her hands were shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. But she was alive, and the soldiers in that valley were alive, and the A-10 that had been her partner through 200 combat missions was being stripped for parts in a hangar somewhere, its fighting days finally done. She thought about Major Cowery, who taught her that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage, that proving yourself meant doing the work without demanding the recognition, that the sky didn't care about your credentials. It only cared whether you had the skill and the courage to claim your place in it. "We did good today," she whispered to the empty room, to the ghost of an aircraft, to all the women who'd fought to earn a seat in a cockpit and been told they weren't strong enough, weren't aggressive enough, weren't built for this kind of work. "We did real good." Sleep came eventually, dreamless and heavy, the kind of sleep that follows the absolute expenditure of everything you have. The investigation started 3 days later, standard procedure for any aircraft damaged beyond repair, though everyone involved already knew what the findings would be. Alina sat through interviews with calm professionalism, answering questions about decision-making processes and tactical considerations with the kind of precision that comes from knowing your actions will be analyzed by people who weren't there, who didn't hear the desperation in Wildfire Actual's voice or see the tracer fire reaching up like deadly flowers. "Captain Vasquez, some have suggested that your decision to make a second gun run with a critically damaged aircraft represented unnecessary risk-taking. How would you respond to that assessment?" The colonel asking the question was old school, the kind of officer who'd come up through fighters and viewed the A-10 as an inelegant compromise, a flying tank for pilots who lacked the finesse for real air combat. Alina had met a dozen versions of him over her career. "Sir, with respect, anyone calling it unnecessary wasn't in that valley," she said evenly. "I had functional weapons systems, clear targets and friendly forces in imminent danger. The tactical mathematics were straightforward. But your aircraft was severely damaged. You could have disengaged, allowed another asset to take over." "There was no other asset, sir. It was me or nobody. And nobody meant those soldiers died. I'm comfortable with the choice I made." The colonel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then something shifted in his face, some private calculation reaching a conclusion. "For what it's worth, Captain, so am I dismissed." The official report came down 2 weeks later. Actions consistent with the highest traditions of military service, exceptional airmanship under combat conditions, recommended for Silver Star. The words were bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Alina had done everything right, and the Air Force wanted to make sure everyone knew it. But awards and commendations weren't why she'd made those gun runs, and they weren't what stayed with her in the months that followed. What stayed with her was a message that arrived through official channels, but felt intensely personal, a request from Captain Torrens at Wildfire Firebase, asking if she'd be willing to meet the soldiers she'd covered that day. She flew out to their forward operating base on a supply run, wearing a clean flight suit and carrying the weight of expectations she hadn't asked for. The soldiers assembled in the mess hall, 37 faces ranging from barely old enough to drink to grizzled sergeants with deployment patches from wars that had their own names now. They stood when she entered, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect required it. Torrens stepped forward first. He was younger than she'd expected, with the kind of face that looked like it smiled easy in other circumstances, but had forgotten how recently. "Captain Vasquez, I'm Torrens. We spoke on the radio." "I remember," Alina said. "You cleared me hot. You saved my men." "We saved each other. That's how it works." They talked for 2 hours, not speeches or formalities, but real conversation about the mission, the valley, the impossible mathematics of combat where seconds determine outcomes and luck is just another word for the gap between what should happen and what does. The soldiers asked questions about flying, about the A-10, about what it felt like to land an aircraft that was more wreckage than machine. And Alina answered honestly, without false modesty but without bravado either. Just the plain truth of someone who'd done a difficult job under terrible conditions and somehow made it home. Afterward, walking back to the flight line with Torrens, Alina felt something settle inside her, a sense of completion that medals and commendations couldn't provide. "Your call sign," Torrens said as they reached the helicopter. "Kestrel. I looked it up after the mission. Read that kestrels can see ultraviolet light, can spot things invisible to other predators. Made me think about how you found those secondary positions when nobody else knew they were there. Like you could see things the rest of us couldn't." Alina smiled, thinking about observation and patience and the art of knowing when to dive. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I just got lucky and the sun was at the right angle. I don't think luck had much to do with it." "Luck always has something to do with it, Captain. The trick is being good enough that when luck shows up, you're ready to use it." She climbed into the helicopter, and Torrens stepped back, raising his hand in a salute that she returned with the kind of precision that spoke to years of practice. As the bird lifted off and the firebase fell away below, Alina looked out at the valley where she'd made those gun runs, at the ridgelines that had bristled with enemy fire, at the empty sky that had been filled with violence, and now was just sky again. The story spread through unofficial channels the way all good stories do in ready rooms and mess halls, in emails home and phone calls to friends still flying. Kestrel became shorthand for a particular kind of courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up when needed and gets the work done regardless of cost. Young pilots, especially women facing the thousand small dismissals that came with trying to earn their place in a culture built by and for men, heard about the A-10 pilot who'd made 2 gun runs with a shredded wing and thought maybe, just maybe, they could do it too. Alina didn't ask for the attention and mostly tried to avoid it, but she understood the responsibility that came with being a story people told. So when a first-year pilot from the academy, barely 23, still so new her flight suit creased sharp, approached her at Bagram and asked if the rumors were true, Alina didn't brush her off. "Some of them," she said. "Aircraft was definitely damaged, definitely made 2 runs, definitely landed hard. They say you should have ejected, that you risked your life unnecessarily." They weren't wrong about the risk, but necessary is a flexible word, depends on what you're measuring against. The young pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, name tape crisp and clean, studied Alina with the kind of intensity that suggested she was looking for answers to questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. "How did you know you could make it? How did you know the aircraft wouldn't just quit on you?" Alina thought about that question, about all the ways it could be answered, about all the complexities of trust and training, and the strange relationship between a pilot and a machine that boiled down to mutual dependence wrapped in protocol. "I didn't know," she said finally, "but I knew that bird had gotten me home from 200 missions. I knew it was built by people who understood that sometimes the pilot needs the aircraft to be tougher than physics says it should be. And I knew that if it was going to quit, it would quit after we'd done everything we could, not before. So I trusted it to hold together long enough for us to finish the job. And it did. What if it hadn't? Then I would have ejected and taken my chances with the silk, but I would have known I did everything possible. Sometimes that's all you get." Lieutenant Chen nodded slowly, and Alina saw something in her expression that was familiar. The weight of doubt that comes with being told you don't belong, that you're not strong enough, not aggressive enough, not built for the work. She'd carried that weight herself once, before Major Cowery had shown her that belonging wasn't given. It was earned through competence demonstrated under conditions that didn't care about gender or expectations or anyone's opinion of what you should be capable of. "Can I ask you something else?" Chen said hesitantly. "How do you deal with it? The way some people look at you like you have to prove yourself twice as hard because you're a woman," Alina finished. "You fly better than them, you make better decisions, you stay calmer under pressure, And eventually, either they figure out you belong here or they don't. But either way, you know, and that's what matters. It was advice Major Cowrie had given her years ago, and Alina had discovered it was true. The respect that came from proving yourself through action was more durable than the respect that came from being handed a seat at the table. It was earned rather than expected, and therefore it was real. They talked for a while longer, and when Lieutenant Chen finally left, Alina felt like she'd passed something forward. Not wisdom exactly, but the accumulated knowledge of what it took to survive and thrive in a profession that didn't make space for you automatically, that required you to carve out your own place through excellence that couldn't be denied. 6 months after the Firebase mission, Alina was assigned to train new A-10 pilots at Davis-Monthan. It was supposed to be a break from combat operations, a chance to decompress and share knowledge before rotating back to the fight. But teaching turned out to be its own kind of challenge, requiring patience and communication skills that weren't covered in flight school. The students came in with varying levels of ability and equally varying levels of attitude. Some were sharp and hungry, eager to learn from someone who'd actually used the aircraft in anger. Others were skeptical, wondering what a combat veteran could teach them about flying that the manual didn't already cover. And a few looked at Alina and saw only what they'd been conditioned to see. A woman in a role that contradicted their assumptions about who belonged in a cockpit. She won them over the same way she'd won over every doubter before, through demonstration rather than argument, through competence that spoke louder than credentials. The first time she took a cocky lieutenant up for a training sortie and showed him what the A-10 could do in the hands of someone who understood it completely, his skepticism evaporated like morning dew. The first time she talked a panicking student through an emergency procedure with a calm that came from having actually faced that emergency over hostile territory, she earned trust that couldn't be taught from a textbook. And slowly, class by class, student by student, Alina built something that felt like legacy. The knowledge that the pilots she trained would carry forward not just technical skills, but a particular approach to the work, one that valued judgment over bravado, precision over aggression, the kind of quiet competence that saved lives without needing recognition for it. "You remind me of my first instructor," one student told her after a particularly challenging sim session. "She never cut us slack, but she also never doubted we could do it. Made all the difference." Alina smiled, thinking about Major Cowrie, about the chain of influence that connected mentor to student across time and circumstance. "Then I'm doing my job right," she said. "Now run that approach again, and this time hold your attitude through the turn. The aircraft will do what you ask it to do, but you have to ask with authority." The years passed in the way that years do for people who find purpose in their work. Alina flew combat missions and training sorties, mentored young pilots and learned from experienced ones, accumulated hours in aircraft that ranged from pristine to barely airworthy. She made captain, then major, then lieutenant colonel, the rank insignia changing but the fundamental work remaining constant: flying, fighting, teaching, surviving. The story of that gun run at the Firebase became part of Air Force lore, one of those tales that got told to new pilots as illustration of what the A-10 could do, what any pilot could do if they had the skill and the courage and the faith that sometimes the aircraft and the mission and the moment align in ways that transform the impossible into the inevitable. But Alina rarely talked about it herself. When people asked, she deflected with humor or changed the subject, or offered the kind of modest acknowledgement that satisfied curiosity without feeding ego. The mission had been important to the soldiers in that valley, and it had been important to her development as a pilot, but it was one mission among hundreds, one day among thousands spent in service of something larger than individual achievement. What mattered more to her was the accumulation of smaller victory students who graduated and went on to successful careers, missions that accomplished their objectives without anyone getting hurt, the quiet satisfaction of knowing She'd contributed to a profession that valued excellence over pedigree and results over rhetoric. She retired at 22 years of service, walking away from the cockpit with the kind of reluctance that comes from leaving behind something that defined you, but knowing it was time. The ceremony was small, held at Davis-Monthan with an audience of fellow pilots and former students and people who'd worked with her over the years. They presented her with a plaque, gave speeches about her service, shared stories that were alternately embarrassing and touching. But the moment that mattered most came afterward, when a young captain, one of her former students, now a combat veteran herself, approached with something wrapped in cloth. "Ma'am, we wanted you to have this. It's from the bird, the one from the Firebase mission." Alina unwrapped it carefully and found herself holding a piece of aluminum, roughly 6 inches square, torn and carbon-scored, and still bearing traces of Air Force gray paint. Part of the left wing from the A-10 that had carried her through that impossible day, salvaged before the aircraft was scrapped and preserved as a relic of a story worth remembering. "Captain Mendoza tracked it down," the young pilot explained. "He said you earned the right to keep a piece of it." Alina held the medal in her hands, feeling its weight, running her fingers over the battle damage that had almost killed her and instead had become evidence of survival. She thought about all the missions that aircraft had flown, all the pilots it had brought home, all the soldiers it had covered when the situation was desperate and the odds were impossible. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This means more than you know." That night, alone in the small house she'd bought near the base, Alina mounted the piece of wing on the wall where she could see it from her desk. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what was possible when skill met courage met necessity, when a pilot and an aircraft became something more than the sum of their parts, when the work mattered more than the recognition, and the mission mattered more than the cost. She sat in the gathering dark and thought about Major Cowery, about all the women who'd fought to earn their place in cockpits and been told they didn't belong, about the students she'd trained and the missions she'd flown and the strange, demanding, occasionally glorious career she'd spent building piece by piece across 2 decades. The metal gleamed faintly in the last light from the window, scarred and torn and absolutely beautiful, a fragment of something larger that had done its job and earned its rest. Outside, an A-10 flew over on approach to Davis-Monthan, the distinctive roar of its engines carrying through the evening air like a hymn in a language only pilots understood. Alina listened until the sound faded, then smiled in the darkness and whispered 2 words that contained everything that mattered. "Kestrel clear."